You first got interested in EEG, obviously, a very long time ago, and I
No,
imagine that
no, not very long time ago. No, the first time that I was exposed to EEG was around 2000, year 2000. So it was 24 years ago. And you know what? Do you know who was my a kind of the first teacher who taught me neurofeedback?
was it Jay Gunkelman?
No, Barry Sternman. Barry
Wow.
Sternman. You know, as I said, it was 2000. As you know, the Soviet Union has been collapsed, and we wanted to to know what to do in these difficult times because I was studying impulse activity of neurons. So we implanted electrodes into the patients with implanted electrodes. And using these electrodes, we were able to record impulse activity of neurons, as well as some other parameters like local field potentials, like infra-low frequency potentials, etc., etc. I was more interested in impulse activity of neurons, and we asked patients to do some cognitive task, and we recorded impulse activity of neurons during this task, such as go no go. Actually, the first time that I ever used go no go task, this was those times, 80s, 90s. But again, the Soviet Union collapsed, and we were not able to continue these studies because there was no money for research, no money for keeping patients in the clinic, and we had to do something which would bring us money, would enable us to continue. And that is why I decided, why don't we start using EEG and EEG in clinical population? And the first thing was actually try to do ADHD. There was no such thing in the Soviet Union in those days. Can you imagine? There was no idea about, no diagnosis like ADHD.
Wow.
Of course, no Ritalin, nothing like that. I talked to psychiatrists, and they told me, what, the boy has to be impulsive, hyperactive, etc. So everyone in Russia is supposed to be ADHD. So why bother? And but we still decided to do it. In order to perform this plan, we needed amplifiers, we needed the software, and that is why we created a company which was called Potential a long time ago, 1990s. Potential, and we developed the software, which was WinEEG. We started working with the patients with attention deficit disorder. For some reason, we didn't know anything about this. So I wrote, and before this, in 1990s, I was in the United States. I met some people, including Roy John and Pribram. Well, anyway, I wrote a paper to Siegfried Hoffmer and to Lubar about neurofeedback, and they actually responded. And we decided, why don't we start using the neurofeedback? So I developed the hardware and software for neurofeedback. The hardware was called Brain Tuner. The software was also called Brain Tuner. Can you imagine? 2000. And people from Norway, they learn about this. And Janelle Billar, who was an assistant in a small of neurofeedback practitioner in a small village, in a small town in South Norway, and they invited Barry's German to give them a workshop, three-day workshop, and they invited me. And that is how I was introduced to to neurofeedback. So it was basically 24 years ago. Can you imagine? A long time
Wow.
ago.
So your interest in neurofeedback was practical because it was hard to find funding for more basic neurophysiological research.
Yeah, no funding. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Developing something that was useful, and that is how we developed the software, software and hardware for EEG recording. At the beginning, it was 19-channel EEG recording. Then the same software and hardware for neurofeedback. By the way, can you imagine that we did also accelerator neurofeedback in those days? Not only just simple bipolar or referential recording of EEG, but accelerator and neurofeedback with the 19-channel.
Wow. Back in the early 2000s.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and I still some people in our laboratory, they're still using this hardware and software. We're still using them.
So how does that differ from the Mitzar amplifiers that are currently in existence and software?
It was absolutely different amplifier, absolutely different. And a very nice software, hardware. I mean, that amplifier was very good.
And who designed that?
I collected a group of people. So in this group, we have the engineer, and one of them, Nikolai Mahev, he was the engineer, so he actually developed these amplifiers, and the software was written by Valery Ponomaryov, and there was also another guy. So together four people, and we did it I think it took us 4 months to make the whole equipment, software, hardware, without any funds, but by enthusiasm.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. And so what was your work before you began, before the sort of disruption where you needed to change into neurofeedback? What was your research focused on prior to that?
Well, it was solid, or you call it basic research. Basic research, as I said, we implanted electrodes into patients' brains, and there are different types of patients, like patients with epilepsy, patients with obsessive compulsive disorder, and Parkinsonian patients. And because there were different types of patients, electrodes were placed in different regions of the brain, including the basal ganglia, the auditory cortex, hippocampus areas. So these are the areas that we had electrodes. We recorded local field potentials as well as impulse activity of neurons. And the basic idea was actually try to understand how the brain works. And we were the first group that found that neurons in the basal ganglia are not only involved in motor actions, in planning and execution of motor actions, but also there were neurons that actually were associated not only with motor but with the cognitive actions. Something as just simply preparation to receive the second stimulus, preparation to make a movement. The P3, a family of P300, when the subject has, the paradigm was similar to go, no go. There was a cue, there was a target, and there were the trigger stimulus. So quite complicated structure, because these were human subject, and we wanted to study the cognitive function. And basically, that we found that neurons that in the basal ganglia there are neurons that are responsive. Involved in implementation of the cognitive function. Nowadays, if you open any textbook, you can find that indeed the basal ganglia are involved in sensory and cognitive function. And we were one of the group that actually directly showed it.
So in those studies, you were looking at the direct activity of the basal ganglia by implanting electrodes there. Then you mentioned the cued go, no-go sort of paradigm. What was your first exposure to the cued no-go, go, no-go paradigm? When did you first learn about that particular sort of methodology?
Basically, I did not know that this is a go, no-go paradigm. In the Soviet Union, we didn't have good access to journals. Now it's many journals are open, give you open access to papers. I'm traveling. I'm lecturing in different countries, so I have now access, and all people in the Soviet Union has access to literature. In those days, we didn't have any access to literature, and basically I didn't know anything about paradigm like go, no go, and I was not involved in ERP research. So it just happened. It just happened that we needed some kind of a task that would involve some cognitive functions. So preparation is one of the cognitive functions. So that means that there must be a cue. And then execution is another function. So that means that there must be a trigger stimulus and something between. And I think that we published several papers in journals. In the international, I think it was International Journal of Psychophysiology, and there was also Journal of EEG Clinical Neurophysiology. We published several papers about this in these journals. And I missed those days,
Yeah,
I missed those days. It was, you don't need. We didn't need to care about money. Scientists got quite nice salaries in those days. And I got the USSR State Prize. That was a kind of Nobel Prize, equivalent of Nobel Prize in the whole Soviet Union. Few people got this. So I got some money. They gave me an apartment, 3-room apartment,
wow,
a car. And when I travel the first class. Can you imagine?
Wow, that's amazing.
The first class. So science, the life for a scientist was quite comfortable. And also, I was allowed to travel. Abroad. So that is, I visited many countries.
Wow. And what year was that?
I got the USSR State Prize 1985.
And what was the prize specifically for? Which of your publications?
Fundamental research in the human physiology. That officially was the statement.
And at that point, what was your sort of most prized publication? Which was the publication you were most proud of?
Oh, there were many publications. Most of them they were in Russian journals. And in those days, it was impossible to publish the paper in international journal because there was a rule. First of all, you have to publish a paper in the journal in the Soviet Union. Okay, the first thing you have to do is publish in your own country. Then you can publish in the West. And can you imagine how you can do it? Because in the West, they actually ask you to publish something which is new, which was never published. So it was not easy. It was not easy to publish. And I started publishing, I think it was after I got the state prize. So I started publishing. I think that actually life was getting more flexible and there were more opportunities, including money, traveling abroad, all this stuff.
So, to return to the topic of sort of the task, the go and no-go task, sounds like what you're saying is that you sort of built something similar to a go, no-go task in your basic physiology research, sort of by necessity, and kind of coincidentally, it turned out to be something similar to a particular paradigm in the scalp ERP research.
Exactly.
So it must have then been, 10 or 15 years until you would implement the go, no-go task in scalp ERPs, right?
Yeah, it was actually, it was historically, that in 92, 95, I was working together with Risto Natanen, the Finnish professor, the father of mismatch negativity. So he actually visited our laboratory, and he was he thought that there was a potential to record mismatch negativity with implanted electrodes. And we got a kind of funding for our joint research. So we traveled back and forth to Finland. As you know, the travel to Finland to Helsinki is just only 4 hours. It's not far away by car. So that's how we start working to him. And of course, we use the oddball paradigm. This is the first thing. And then I designed this the 2 stimulus task. Remember, the first is animal or plant. The second is also animal and plant. The combination, four different combination, and the subject has to press a button to animals. Okay, it's a kind of a standard task. With Arista, I designed the task that instead of animal plants, we used sounds like low tone sound and high tone sound. Okay, and we asked the subject to press a button. I think 2 high tones, and I still have a lot of data from this. I actually never published this data, but we got very interesting results. And some results were kind of I couldn't explain them, like electrodes were in anterior cingulate cortex, and we found a kind of unusual response, like negative positive response to the first stimulus and to the second, especially when the subject there was mismatch between the first stimulus and the second stimulus. Now we know that it's and to now go away. But in those days, we didn't know this, and it was a quite interesting phenomenon. It was not easy to explain it to you. I got some theory to explain this. I tell this theory to Risto Natanen, and he said, well, you know, that I have my own theory. I mean, Risto told me that he had his own theories, and I needed to to follow his ideas. So he was a very knowledgeable, very dedicated person. You know, he died recently, unfortunately.
Yeah, as well as Barry Sturman.
Yeah, and he died of Alzheimer. And I think that he taught me a lot. And the first, basically, the first recording with local field potentials that was done with him.
So say more about that. Local field potentials from a physiology perspective. They were recording local field potentials with implanted electrodes.
Yeah, with implanted electrodes. Yeah. So what we did, we had gold electrodes implanted into the patient's brain, and we were able, of course, record this EEG that potentials in EEG frequency band, and we were able to record local field potentials, and they are indeed local field potentials. You know that you implant electrodes and you record the potentials from this local area. And sometimes two electrodes, one with the difference of 300 microns, so 0.3 millimeters, so very small difference. They show quite different tie dynamics. So can you imagine they were indeed quite local. They were.
Yeah, it's interesting to look at scalp EEG and then to look at, ECOG, where there's like a mesh of implanted electrodes on the surface.
Yeah. Well, in terms of EEG, yes, but in terms of ERPs, it's another world. It's just another world. For example, this oddball paradigm is a simple paradigm, and basically in this paradigm, especially when the patient don't need to do anything, we just have to read a book or watch a TV. So in this paradigm, N2 wave in response to deviant stimulus appears. N2 wave, which has a frontal distribution. That was all. But when electrodes are implanted, you can see that this modest response at FZ has a big variability inside the brain, the cortex. So one thing is in the primary auditory cortex, complete other thing in the secondary auditory cortex, and also complete different things in the association auditory cortex. Everything was different. And on the scalp, you see just small response. And the difference is, of course, the amplitude was much, much higher. On the scalp, the mismatch negativity is just 2 microvolts. Inside the cortex, it could be 20, 30, 40 microvolts. quite high amplitude responses, and quite different in different cortical areas.
And so now that we have more sort of advanced scalp ERP processing methods, how much of those sort of differential activations that you're talking about, the primary, secondary association areas, are we able to see using, for example, independent component analysis?
Yeah, I did it. So in HBI database, we had ERP recorded in the auditory oddball task, and I was able to, using this blind source separation method, to decompose the component of ERP from the collection of ERP that was recording for quite many healthy subjects. Indeed, they were similar. They were similar to what we recorded from the implanted electrodes. That is true. That is true. So basically, the blind source separation is a good opportunity to go deep in the cortex.
And do you think you ever would have thought to decompose ERPs with independent component analysis had you ever not done that sort of basic physiology research with implanted electrodes first?
Yeah, the idea to do the independent component analysis and blind source separation came from we started recording ERP in the healthy subject. You know, the idea. The first time when I met Roy John, and he was the first that recorded the database for EEG spectra in eyes closed condition. And in those days, I was thinking about how to do it for event-related potentials. I asked him how much did he invest in this in collecting database, and he immediately told me the sum. It's worth $30 million in grants. And when Andy Miller, remember that in 2001, Jay Gunkelman invited me to come over to Monterey in California at the ISNA meeting. In those days, he was the president of ISNA, and he gave to European a free lunch. As you know, there is no free lunch in general, so he actually suggested to us to organize a chapter, a European chapter of ISNA, which we did. And I was selected the first president of this chapter, ISNA. And we started working. We started doing workshops, and we invited Jay Gunkelman to these workshops. And I remember at one of the workshops, it was in a small village, in a small resort near Lisbon in Portugal. And Andy Mueller, he was at this workshop, and he asked, you are talking about event-related potentials, how we can use this in clinical practice. I told him that you know what, in order to do it, you need to have a normative database. He said, why don't we do it? I said, do you have $30 million? All the money are in Switzerland. He said, well, money is not a problem.
There's some free lunch.
Yeah. And, I didn't take him seriously, but in 3 months after that, he came over to St. Petersburg. It was cold, very cold, and he was freezing to death. And at his trip home, he took 2 pieces of equipment mid-SAR amplifiers with him. In 1 month, I designed the whole all tasks that we implemented, including this go no go task. And that is how we collected. And by the way, in 3 months, we collected 250 subjects. It was children aged from 7 to 17, 3 months. And the next 6 months, we developed the whole software. And by the way, the software including ICA, independent component analysis.
So that was the beginning of what would become the HBI database.
Yeah. So everything was done. It was done during the first year. And then Andy collected also adults. It was another year. Another my postgraduate student. Just only Andy, his assistant, I think Jan Kodran, and a postgraduate student from my laboratory. So 3 people were recording. 3 people recorded the whole 1,000 population.
Wow.
Just only 3 people.
And that is with the eyes open and eyes closed conditions. And which of the ERP tasks?
5 different tasks. This acute go, no go, mathematical task, this auditory oddball task, mismatch negativity task, mathematical, 5 different tasks.
And which of those tasks do you feel like has the most sort of clinical utility?
I think that go, no go task. It's the most studied task. I did not actually estimate that studying one task would take so long. I did not estimate it. I thought that, that the simple component P300, P3 no-go, and 2 P3, you can find these components, these waves in literature. So basically, what else? But it turned out that when you started applying the blind source separation, that you find some other waves, components, and you don't know the functional meaning of this component, then you have to do some additional study in order to understand what is the functional meaning of this component that you extract using this blind source separation method. So you need to change a task, change the instructions again to collect a number of patients, of healthy subjects. It's a lot of work. And also, the first thing we needed to do is to prove that the retest reliability is quite high. This is the first thing that we actually did. And it turned out that the retest reliability is very high. So every time when we change the equipment, I'm using my brain in order to calibrate the equipment. So I was recording 7 times during the last 20 years. And I know the task quite well. So, and when I put all 7 recording on each other, I was amazed. They are identical. Identical. I know the task. The reaction time was the same in all tasks. The reaction time variance of the same. And ERPs. I know my ERPs.
Wow.
I know. And and after that, I analyze a lot of ERPs in healthy subject, because when I'm doing the workshop in healthy subject, I ask them to record ERPs, so I know ERPs in what ERP look like in healthy subject, in the database, in the recordings, in patients, thousands of them. ERPs is unique signature. It's indeed unique signature, and it's amazing. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think the same can't be said for, QEEG. Like if you were to record your resting state EEG 7 times over the course of 20 years, there's going to be probably more of a difference than there would be in the event-related potentials, and even from day to day.
that's very true. The EEG spectra, the spontaneous EEG is more flexible. It depends, you ate a good dinner and you record EEG after this dinner, you see a lot of alpha in your EEG. You drank some wine before that and you see changes in EEG. You didn't sleep well, and the EEG changed. And also the EEG spectra in most of the subjects are quite simple. In healthy subject, nothing happens in eyes open condition. I mean that EEG is just the low frequency, the high amplitude, that's what we have. And in eyes closed condition, you can see occipital alpha. In healthy subject, and in most of the healthy subject, look like that. So in some subject, it's about 20, 30, 40% depend on the population. You can see mu rhythms. Even in smaller number of subjects, you can see frontal midline theta rhythm, frontal beta rhythm, even in much smaller number of subjects. So you see that in most of the healthy subject, EEG spectra look very simple, nothing fancy.
And I assume that means that in the ERPs, there's a little bit more complexity, even in healthy subjects.
Yeah, the complexity is quite large. For example, you can decompose ERP in, say, 9, 10 components. Okay? Each component is characterized by amplitude and the latency. So altogether, it's if it's 9 components, it's 18 parameters, quite a lot, and different types of combination can occur. So some people, for example, may have the large P1 and 1 wave visual, okay, which characterized the activation of amygdala. Some people, they may have the high amplitude of P3 no-go recorded at FZ, etc., etc. So the combination quite large, and the pattern is quite different, could be quite different. And it tells you about the subject.
You named your most recent book Functional Neuromarkers for Psychiatry. How many of those neuromarkers are ERP related versus EEG or QEEG related?
It's a good question. It's a good question, but I still think that EEG, you indeed need to record EEG, because what is the difference between EEG, spontaneous EEG, and event related potential? They are completely different entities. And the spontaneous EEG reflect cortical mechanism of self-regulation. So in order to keep cortex at some working level, the nature develops several mechanisms. Okay, for example, the sensory system, in order to keep the activity in the sensory system at some working level, it developed the so-called thalamocortical network, okay, which actually can modulate, can control information flow from the thalamus to the cortex. And this mechanism is responsible for a family of alpha rhythms, like alpha rhythm in the visual modality, alpha rhythm in the somatosensory modality. And by the way, there is also alpha rhythm in the auditory modality, but we can record this auditory tau rhythm we can record only using MEG signal. Rita Hari from Helsinki University, she was the first one who recorded this. Well, anyway, they are completely different entities. So one EEG spectra, they reflect the mechanism of cortical self-regulation. And there are different mechanisms like sensory system, the thalamocortical networks, alpha rhythm, like the rhythmicities of the cognitive control system, like frontal midline theta rhythm, like frontal beta rhythmicities. So there are many rhythms that has a specific function of cortical self-regulation, different mechanism of cortical self-regulation. Even related potential, they show you how the information is processed in the neuronal networks of the brain. Okay, this is a completely different question and different topic. And sometimes, quite often, I mean, not only sometimes, quite often I see when I analyze EEG and even related potentials in a group of patients, you see EEG spectra look completely normal and ERP look very abnormal, especially in adults, not so much in children. I think that in children, their brain are developing, and there could be many reasons why these mechanisms of cortical self-regulation are not normal. They are abnormal. They generate some abnormal waves, abnormal oscillations. But in adults, you don't see it often. Patients with schizophrenia, patients with OCD, patients with depression, they don't have many deviation from the reference. At least the effect size is not big. So you know that in order to use a certain parameter, functional neuromarker in clinical practice, the effect size of when you differentiate two groups of patients should be more than 0.8, which is a quite large number. And in EEG spectra, this large, we never saw such large differences between in different patient groups.
Yeah.
For example, you have a group of patients with schizophrenia. You get the grand average, and you try to compare with the grand average of healthy subjects, and you look at the EEG spectra, and they look similar. Just small differences, and you compute effect size, and it's small.
Which I think has been a point of frustration for people in the QEEG community as far as trying to prove to other areas of mental health, whether it's psychiatry or neurology, that the QEEG approach is even worthwhile.
Yeah, exactly. I think that this pharmaca EEG, remember that there was a kind of, even there was society pharmaca EEG, and the people, they thought that using EEG, spontaneous EEG spectra, they would solve all the problem. No, not at all. Of course, even-related potentials also, as any method, they have limitations. That is quite clear. There is no doubt that ERP, they also have limitations. But at least they higher diagnostic power in comparison to EEG spectrum, at least at some disorders. I'm not talking about, of course, epilepsy. Of course,
Right.
in the cases of epilepsy, some patterns in EEG are important. I'm not talking about EEG in sleep, but in general, yes, when it's just spontaneous EEG, eyes open condition, eyes closed condition, yes.
And so, did you choose to title your book with that word psychiatry because you felt that the combination of resting state EEG and ERP sort of neuromarkers would have more of an impact for psychiatry than QEG alone?
Yeah, exactly. And I also thought that psychiatry needs a kind of biomarkers. Definitely, because psychiatrists, they usually don't look at EEG. They don't look at ERPs. They don't know how to read, how to make sense of them. They're using their own methods. And maybe this book, if they read this, I know some psychiatrists, they know the methodology and they're using this methodology in their practice. They're using EEG or PIS, and more important, they're using this method of neuromodulation like TDCS, TMS, photobiomodulations.
So we were talking about pharmaco-EEG and psychiatry. What study has impacted you the most in terms of your appreciation for EEG and ERPs as far as medication and pharma are concerned?
Well, I was working together with Risto Natanen, and he knew about mismatch negativity more than anyone in the world. I remember he started talking about application of mismatch negativity for diagnosis of schizophrenia, and he developed the task, the audible task, in which he presented different types of deviant stimuli. And I remember he was talking about schizophrenia, and he showed that indeed the mismatch and P3A, novelty P300, are quite deviant in patients with schizophrenia. And this is a kind of a small ERP component. The mismatch negativity is just 2 microvolts. And I thought, wow, that there must be something in ERP that would help psychiatrists, to help them to make a diagnosis, not only a diagnosis, but also a prognosis. Geir Ogrim from Norway, from the hospital, from Children's Hospital in Norway, he showed that ERP can actually make a prognosis how the patient will respond to Ritalin. You know that only about 60% of ADHD children, they respond to Ritalin. In order to actually to define who is going to be a responder, who is not, who will be a non-responder, then you need to make quite long studies. So you have to give a child Ritalin for 4 weeks. And then after 4 weeks, you have to ask the opinion of a child, of his parents, of his teachers, and on the basis of this have to decide if the subject would benefit from taking Ritalin or not. And using ERP, we actually showed that what you need to do is just to record ERP before, give them Ritalin, record after, look at ERPs, and you can define who is going to be a responder, who is going to be a non-responder. So the beauty is not only a diagnosis, but sometimes it actually helps to make diagnosis, because I was working together with a psychiatrist, a good friend of mine. He was the kind of director of a clinic of psychiatry, and he was using the event-related potentials for helping him in diagnosis, because sometimes he didn't know if it's schizophrenia or not. What is this? And he usually asked me, is this schizophrenia? Is this disorder, that disorder? And I was able to help him. But so ERP can help a psychiatrist not only in diagnosis but also in prognosis. They can indicate what part of the neuronal network in the brain is impaired and how to activate this part of the network, of the neuronal network. What kind of treatment is it could be neuromodulation protocol, it could be any medicine, like in this case Ritalin. So it gives the psychiatrists the tool for making prognosis.
So I'd like to just drill down on that particular example a little bit. It's of personal interest to me, attention, and just with how many people are getting diagnosed with, or now people are sort of self-diagnosing, with different disorders, which is its own issue. But to bring it back to the brain, what does the response to methylphenidate look like in terms of neuromarkers when it's a match for a person? What neuromarker are we looking at in that population, and what's changing with people that are going to respond well?
Yeah. Well, theoretically and experimentally, when you perform the task, there are several neuronal networks are involved in implementing the task, the good no-go task. And for example, one of them is generated in the parietal cortex. So the subject, after you give him the instruction, his brain constructs a model of the task. Okay, and the model of the task includes the stimulus-response link. And when you present a stimulus, is a task stimulus, this task stimulus activate these links, and this happens in a complex network, and one of these network localized in the parietal cortex. Okay, so it's a kind of one activation of the stimulus response link is one thing. Then the other thing is that the subject is preparing for the second stimulus, and there is a kind of the proactive cognitive control which is associated with the preparation to receive a second stimulus and preparation to make a response, to make a movement. And there are two different preparatory activities. The neuromarkers of these activities, the psychological operation. Then the other operation is the detection of conflict. So you know that when after the first stimulus, animal, the subject receives the image of a plant. That it does not fit his the subject expectation, because the subject prepares to press a button as fast as possible and as precise as possible to the animal, the second animal. So, and in the brain there is a special areas, the special networks that is actually involved in this operation. So detecting conflict occurs at both at the sensory level and the execution level. Okay, and we have different components. And then the other wave, the other component is the component that is associated with suppression of action. Okay, so you prepare the action, everything is ready in your cortex, then the no-go stimulus, and you have to inhibit the prepared action. Okay, and this inhibition operation is associated with inhibition component. And the question is, what do you think? I mentioned just only a few of the components that can be extracted and measured in the brain ERPs and the subject ERPs. What do you think? What component is impaired? Is actually a neuromarker for Ritalin?
I'm going to guess the inhibition.
And your guess is correct. So this indeed, this is the if you look at accelerated imaging of this component, it's located in the pre-supplementary motor cortex. It's indeed, for some reason, it actually has some logic, because this area receives inputs from the basal ganglia through the ventral thalamus. So you know that there is a motor loop, basal ganglia thalamocortical loop in the brain, which receives inputs from the different parts of the cortex, including the premotor, supplementary, the parietal cortex. Everything goes to the putamen. It's a part of the basal ganglia. From the putamen, it goes to the globus pallidus, and globus pallidus inhibits the thalamus, the ventral thalamus, and then if something happens, go or no go, depending, either the thalamus is inhibited or disinhibited, depending, and the component that is associated with the no-go inhibition, that is the responsible, that is indicator of that tells you if the subject will respond to Ritalin or not, because the basal ganglia, and we know that indeed Ritalin actually blocks the receptors, the dopamine inhibitors receptors in the basal ganglia. So the reason is this, and it's quite interesting that indeed this component is, and the subject with who have impairment of this component, they are responders. Okay, so you can simply measure the ERP, compute this component, compare it with the database, and you can actually tell if the subject would respond to Ritalin or not.
Just to play the devil's advocate here a little bit, from a pharmaco EEG perspective, I was speaking with Jay about this a couple of weeks ago, and he was saying that, in his opinion, people with frontal theta activity and inattention tend to respond well to methylphenidate or Ritalin. So what's the overlap there? Is frontal theta activity perhaps associated with this impaired function of the pre-supplementary motor cortex, or is the basal ganglia sort of like a shared source for that activity?
Well, first of all, you know that the frontal midline theta is a healthy rhythm.
Right.
It's a normal, healthy rhythm that can be seen in European population. It can be seen in about 20-40% of the healthy population. By the way, in the Asian population, I think that number is double. But if we're talking about ADHD, there is a specific subgroup of patients with ADHD who indeed have elevation of this frontal midline theta rhythm. Too much of the frontal midline theta rhythm, and this theta rhythm, it goes in bursts. Usually in healthy subjects, the bursts are around 1-2 seconds, and they're quite rare. Okay, and in ADHD patients of this subtype, there is no burst. The alpha just goes in long runs, and on
You mean the theta?
Yeah,
The theta
frontal
goes in.
theta that is measured at FZ. And you see it, and you can see it even by eye. So the frontal midline, this is a special group, and it's quite rare. It's about 10%. So I don't think that this theta is associated with the responders to Ritalin or not. I'm not sure. We actually did not do any analysis of this specifically regarding the frontal midline theta, but my guess would be quite different numbers. 10% of patients with the frontal midline theta, 10%, and 60% of responders. Different numbers.
The relationship to psychiatry is always interesting to me, because on the one hand, you've mentioned that not a lot of psychiatrists are utilizing assessments like this, or some. And at the same time, this concept of diagnosis is in some sense aided by looking at the EEG, and also complicated, because once we start to investigate the actual brain function, it makes the diagnostic terminology in some sense seem at least inadequate, because there's so many different subtypes. And it leads some people to sort of want to do away with the diagnostic model altogether. There've been, I forget the name of the person, but famous statements like, that the DSM is invalid, and I think generally within the neurofeedback community, an attitude towards diagnosis where it's not our job to diagnose, and sort of keep it to yourself, because ultimately the brain is going to paint a more complicated picture, and potentially more prognostically useful picture than the word ADHD itself.
That's very true.
What is your attitude towards diagnosis in terms of like your communication of your findings?
Well, they were just recently carried out research using, AI, artificial intelligence. It's a fashion. Everyone wants to use. Well, we tried to use machine learning approach. We have a lot of data, so we took the even related potentials of a group of schizophrenic patients and a group of healthy controls. And I think that the specificity and sensitivity was about 0.9. Not bad, but definitely not perfect. Definitely not perfect. And basically, I don't think that the issue of diagnosis is indeed very important. I think that, first of all, psychiatrists, they make diagnosis on their own criteria. Okay, the criteria is in DSM-5 or in ICD-10, whatever. Okay, and they are taught how to do it. It's they know how to do it, and they're going to stick to it. And I don't think that our goal would be primary goal of giving them a tool for making diagnosis. For helping, yes, to help them to make the right diagnosis, it could be a good idea. So, for example, if they don't know what kind of diagnosis to put, and we know that for example OCD and schizophrenia, they have completely different ERP patterns. So even by naked eye, we can differentiate patients with OCD and schizophrenia, and in such cases we can easily help them. So it's not a problem. But our goal is not to make the correct diagnosis. Our goal is to demonstrate what kind of neuronal network is actually impaired and how it is impaired. And on the basis of our previous knowledge, how can we help the patient to restore this lost function? And we know that there are several neuromodulation techniques like the TMS, TDCS, photobiomodulation, this kind of neuromodulation techniques. And we can suggest what kind, on the basis of what we see, what kind of treatment. For example, the subject with the component, the inhibitory components, how he can restore it. So we know the topography of this component quite clear. And we know that if you apply transcranial direct current stimulation or nodal stimulation, that a nodal stimulation can activate this part of the cortex. So if we want to help the subject to activate this kind of area, that we can do either TDCS or TMS on this area. So I think that, so basically helping in diagnosis, of course, is a good goal of our approach, but not the primary goal. The primary goal is to help with constructing protocol of neuromodulation.
What has been your experience with neuromodulation, either on yourself or working with, treatment groups?
Well, It's a good idea. As a physicist, I was very skeptical. I was very skeptical in relation to neurofeedback. I was very skeptical at the beginning, and I was also very skeptical in relation to TMS, TDCS, or whatever. The basic is that you can activate the cortex. There is no problem. You can inject, for example, the current. Then you can depolarize the membrane, no problems. You can change the collective activity of the neurons. You can do it, no problems. Then using this a kind of plastic changes in the cortex, you can change them, but sooner or later the information would goes back. Basically, that's how it works. Our experience tell us just opposite. It indeed works, and I usually tell people this kind of anecdotal case. The patients with autism who didn't speak, and we recorded EEG in these patients. We found theta activity. Quite often, you found this kind of excessive theta activity either at the left temporal or the right temporal area in young children with autistic spectrum disorders. So we found it, and we placed a note on this area. So definitely it was quite clear that what we needed to do is to activate this cortical area. This cortical area was idling. So we did it. And on the way to the car, the parents phoned to me and said, well, the subject started talking. The boys started talking. Can you imagine? Sometimes it happens. Sometimes it happens. One session make a big difference. Okay, and after 2 or 3 weeks, they came to me and told me, the boy talked too much. Can you switch him off? Yeah. So basically, it looked like that when you activate this cortical area and the subject starts using it, so and this area become involved in speech production, in speech understanding, then it's for quite a long time. It indeed works. You just need to demonstrate the subject how he can use it. Another experience, I was working with neurofeedback, and as you know, that we use different types of neurofeedback, and one of them was activation frontal beta. And I remember one subject told me, you know what? Before I didn't know what does it mean to be attentive. He simply did not know how to focus. And when we demonstrated him, look, this is a beta, your frontal beta is a kind of correlate of your focusing attention, try to increase it. And he did, and he found it works. Unfortunately, it works not for everyone. And you need to find out what is the best neurofeedback protocol for this particular subject.
So it's interesting. You mentioned doing TDCS with the person with autistic spectrum disorder. And it gets into a little bit the sort of different notions about sort of, invasive versus non-invasive. but also sort of paradigms of learning. And, within the sort of formal definitions, neurofeedback is considered a learning paradigm, a kind of operant conditioning, and stimulation technologies such as TDCS, not so much. But you're speaking to something which kind of betrays that, sort of model, which is that after having activated a particular region with these, neuroplastic effects of TDCS, basically changing the polarization state of groups of neurons, which in turn perhaps affects, blood flow, perfusion, that once a person gets to a particular state, the brain itself can learn and behaviorally sort of start to engage regions differently. Can you comment on that? Do you agree? Have you seen people learn as a result of neurostimulation techniques alone?
Yeah, I think so. Well, I'm not a practitioner. I'm not the medical doctor. But in this respect, I can rely only on what my students, my co-worker, tell me about. So in my laboratory, I have two centers, one using TDCS and neurofeedback for ADHD, for mostly ADHD, the other one for mostly for children with autistic spectrum disorder, and they both are using TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation, and they indeed tell me that it works quite well. But again, not for everyone, and you need to know the reason why you place electrodes. So, sometimes not talking is not related to deactivation of the Wernicke Broca area. So it could be quite different thing. But as I said, I can rely on reaction experience of my friends who are working for me, and their experience is very, very positive. I also have a good friend of mine who has experience working with adults, different types of elder, different neurological conditions, different neurological conditions, and he had a long queue of patients waiting. And he wrote several books. Unfortunately, all of them they are in Russian. But he claims me that indeed, he can change it. He can change it. And by the way, the intensity of the current they are using, they're relatively small. I was actually amazed. In the best, the amount of the current is about 2 milliampere. And they were using quite large electrodes, 2 milliampere with quite large electrodes. And my friends, they also are using similar electrodes, but the intensity, the currents are quite smaller. So some of them they're using. Well, it depends, of course. In children, you must use smaller currents, but even when they work with the adults, the current are smaller. So they are smaller than 1 milliampere.
Wow.
And they work. But all of them, they're using EEG. And in the case when it's possible, they use even related potentials. Not always it is possible, especially in children with autistic spectrum disorder.
Yeah, it can be difficult to have them sit for the task.
Yeah, unless they are high functioning.
So you mentioned on another call that you're working on your books. And I'm curious what your next project is and what your next publication might be.
Well, I'm working on papers, and recently I submitted a paper on the P3Q. I proved in this paper that P3Q indeed it reflects the strengths of the link between stimulus and response. It was quite interesting paper. The next paper that I am preparing is about the preparation to the stimulus, so proactive cognitive control. And I'm working on this paper. And I'm also planning to write a book about a kind of, the concise guide for clinical neuroscience. Okay, so I'm trying to put together all information that I got on this subject to put together and to. So I'm planning. I think that I got enough data, clinical data. So I think that it can be useful. And one idea is to, first of all, to give the readers the ability to use WinEEG and to present them with the cases so they can use these cases.
Yeah, that sounds like a really exciting idea to combine kind of a written guide with the software tool that people would eventually be using.
Yeah, and also to give them the cases, ERP and EEG cases of different disorders.
Well, if there's anything I can do to help make that project a reality,
thank you,
let
Nick.
me know.
Thank you, Nick. Well, basically, that my first book was actually designed in the same way. So remember, the first book I developed the version which are called HBI database version of WinEEG. So it was a kind of easy version of WinEEG. I provided different cases, but I don't know what happens with this. So some people they told me that they have difficulty of accessing these EEG files from the web page. And this website was under control of the Elsevier, and I cannot change anything. I cannot help them. So I'm just thinking maybe the book is not published by a big company like Elsevier, but just a kind of a book in electronic format. In this way, it would be that everything would be under my control. I can easily upload the EEG cases, and I can easily help people, supervise people. So that would be the case, because I understand that it's actually not easy. You need a lot of motivation in order to follow this learning curve to learn WinEEG.
It takes a while.
Yeah, it's quite complicated software, and it has a lot of potential. I think that we are using probably 50% of all abilities that WinEEG provides. Well,
and are you currently involved in sort of the development of WinEEG or the feedback to the software people?
Yeah. Every week we are talking with Valerie, with the programmer. We're discussing what we can do. Yeah, we are doing it.
Do you want to chat about the plans for Sassoon briefly?
Yeah.
What's your overall thoughts on whether you'll be able to travel?
It's a good question, and I wish I could answer it, but I don't see any now possibility, except probably going to, to Kazakhstan or to Uzbekistan, to some other country, and where they have the embassy, the American embassy, in order to get it. Theoretically, we can try. I think theoretically it's feasible.
And is there?
But the question is, do we need it? I think that now with new technology, we can easily do by remote.
Yeah,
Remotely.
no, I mean, of course, we can do it remotely, and I'm going to be helping out with the audio, visual, etc. So there's no problem in doing it remotely. But of course, people would like to see you, and I'm sure you'd like to see people too, if you can.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. Say it again. When it's going to be?
October 12th to 14th, middle of October. It's Thursday, Friday, Saturday.
And what place?
It's in Sassoon City, which is where Jay lives.
Oh, you mean California?
In California.
Uh-huh.
So, regardless of whether you present in person or on Zoom, what specifically would you like to present about? Because the general theme for the conference is on validating EEG and ERP neuromarkers and on sort of clinical application. And obviously, you have contributed to a lot of different sort of clinical areas in that.
Yeah, I think that people, they definitely need something which is clinically related. I can talk about ERP in clinical, in psychiatric conditions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We want to keep it going in perpetuity, with the spirit of, really rigorous neuroscience and also sort of a close community. It's different from other conferences. Like I went to all 4 of the conferences this past year: AAPB, ISNR, Neurofields, and the Sassoon Summit. And the Sassoon Summit, it's the most intimate. It's like 80 people, 70 people. You're all in the same room the whole time. And then, there's a bar right there at this yacht club. So everyone talks afterwards. And most of the people are engaged with EEG, with working with Jay in some capacity, really passionate and curious people. So it makes for a exciting conference.
Yeah. That's a good.
Well, any final words for the audience on EEGworld?
Now, you just need to start. I mean that the only advice is you can actually listen to the talks, you can contemplate, you can read the books, etc. But what really change your life is just buying equipment, switch off, is start recording yourself, start recording your friends, patients, etc. And it's everything goes with experience, so experience is essential for this kind of work.
Just got to get going.
Yeah, exactly.
And what do you want to talk about the next time on EEGworld?
Maybe something about more specific, about maybe about ADHD, like post-traumatic stress disorder, something. I think that people probably would like to learn something more specific.
All right. I on my list of things to discuss is the Cook paper, the famous paper by Cook, looking at the frequency of EEG activity and blood perfusion.
Oh, you mean Jan Cook?
Yes.
1997.
Yeah. And it's a very famous study in the field that, as far as I know, hasn't really been replicated. So I think it'd be interesting to discuss that and what your thoughts on that are the next time.
Okay, we can do it. Something which is more specific. That would be good. Let's
Cool.
talk about the association between EEG and the perfusion or fMRI, basically.
Yeah. All right, Yuri. Good to see you.
Yuri.
Thanks. And we'll chat again soon.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
All right.
Thank you,
Take
Nikki.
care. Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.